Hey, it's TDA and welcome back to episode 7 of this perfect ratio run. Today I hope you guys are in for a challenge because this will be a complicated build. It took me forever to get a layout that worked well because we will have 8 different resources that will have to feed into our end product. I have no idea if this is going to be the most complicated build in this run, but it's definitely going to be the most complicated and probably largest build so far. And what we are building today is, of course, our ILS, and I have building over here. And yes, this is the only end product building that's going to go in this build, and we're going to end up needing this space for it. So, yeah. Might be a little longer build than usual, maybe, I don't know, let's find out. But I hope you guys are in for a very satisfying build because despite the 8 different resources going into this, I think I ended up with a pretty nice, convenient, kind of straightforward-ish looking build that has no spaghetti in it and actually looks pretty good. So, and let's just get on with it. Now, I actually did have to revamp my entire way of approaching the builds for this, so that might actually speed up the builds I have to do after this, because it is a madness when you're trying to make a building that by itself only needs 3 different resources, but of course there is also the smaller version of this building going into that, so that's the planetary logistics station, and that needs 4 different resources as well. There's a little bit of overlap between the two, so that is good. But all in all, these two need a lot of resources. So specifically, we will need the alloy for this one. We will also need some particle containers for this one. And those two are kind of the real culprits, along with the fact that we will need... Not that one, not that one, that one. We will need some processors for this one. So I will mark that up so we know what we're doing. And of course, this will also need steel. So let's assume we're getting that from over here. And let's mark that up so we can see it. So steel. And of course, what we also need is some titanium over here. And let's mark that over here so we can actually see that as well. So then we have the steel, we have the titanium, we have the processors, and we can actually get the... particle containers from over here, assuming that we have 2 belts going in there. So the particle containers go into the PLS, but also into the ILS, Interstellar Logistics Center. ILS and PLS for short. Now, before you can start this build, remember that you need to do some of the yellow research, and if you did my previous build, you should have access to that now. You need the alloy, and you also need, of course, to research the Interstellar Logistics System. So that's about 200 yellow signs each. It's not the biggest of a problem, but if you want to use my blueprint, you should also research mass construction level 4, because that's the yellow research, and I will probably use the 3600 facility limit, because if I have to put it in a 900 facility limit, that's going to be a challenge. So let's put it like that. So research this, use it, it's awesome. Okay, so that's already 5 materials that we need to get going. So let's start with something simple, shall we? Let's also flip this around, because of course we have the titanium coming in from the other side. And we will need some smelters for that. And as before, I will leave the sorters out for the moment, but I will focus on that as soon as we have all our buildings placed. And I'll just cut that out of the building process, because seeing me connect dozens of sorters is probably not the most interesting. Okay, so we will need 6 smelters producing titanium. Why 6? Because that's how the ratios turn out. The ratios in this specific build, as with most of our buildings, might not be completely perfect, because then the ratios are really annoying. Why? Because the Interstellar Logistics Center produces at 30 per second, so it needs 1 PLS going in per 30 seconds. But the PLS itself actually produces at 20-second intervals. So by default, if we would have to match this up completely in a perfect ratio, we would need to build 2 of these and then 3 of these, which is way more than you will ever need, and that just blows up this build even bigger than it is already going to be. So I recommend kind of fudging the perfect ratios here. We will keep it as perfect as we can, as always, but increasing this build to even twice this limit, I think is a little bit overkill, just to make sure you don't build one smelter or one assembler too much or too few, just to keep it perfect. So that's my recommendation. If you want to keep it completely perfect for this build, then by all means, but I don't think that should bother you if it didn't bother you in my previous build either, because we had the same issue there. But it will be pretty damn close to perfect, actually, because it's not that of an annoying build, to be honest, to make. It's just very complex. Now, this is titanium, but we will also need a titanium alloy, and that is being built from titanium itself. And as we will see when I load up the recipe over here, it's going to be built from titanium, but we will also need 2 other items, and that is the steel, and we will also need to bring in some sulfuric acid. Now, we can do that, but we also need to make sure we are exporting this. So let's see, we need steel, but we also need steel over here, as you can see, because the PLS also needs some steel. So what we can actually do is do the following. Let's have this belt input the steel, and so that means we have to get steel from somewhere over there. So remember, this is the steel, this is the steel. I'm going to be marking up a lot of these things in this build. Probably should flip this around. There we go. Just because it's very easy to lose track of what's going on. And then of course we are making the titanium alloy over here, so that will be exporting into there. That means we already have 2 items on this side and we have 1 on the other side. So we need a 3rd belt, and that's going to come up over here in the top, where we are going to need some, let's see if this is on the correct height. Yes, it is. We are going to need some sulfuric acid. Now, sulfuric acid is actually used in 2 places in this build, because in order to make these particle containers, we're also going to need some graphene, which also requires you to build some additional sulfuric acid. So this sulfuric acid is actually going to be used for 2 purposes. It's going to be used for the alloy as well as the graphene. Now, before we worry about that part of the build, we are going to have to build quite a lot of other things. So let's hop down over here for a second. So what we have here is processors. We also need to make some processors. Now, we can do that fairly easily because we have some room over here. And what we're going to do is we are going to build one small part over here. We're going to build 4 units processing processors. Listen to me. Okay, so processors, 4 of them, because that is actually the amount that we need. These are producing at 3 per second, and we're going to need 40 per 20 seconds, so we actually need 2 per second. So these 4 are going to produce that 2 per second. Actually, they're not going to be producing 2 per second, because of course we have 3, so it's going to be 1.33 per second. And that is going to be enough because we are not producing 1 PLS per 20 seconds. We have to produce a little less than that because this doesn't need 1 per 20 seconds. It needs 1 per 30 seconds. So I adjusted the inputs on the PLS in order to match the speed at which we're going to be producing the ILS. So if you're wondering why the ratios are off when you're comparing it to the PLS build, that's because they are tuned to the ILS build. Now, you could actually be wondering, TDA, why are you not building PLS first? That's very simple. I don't intend to use any PLS, at least not at this point, at all in this entire run. Why not? The ILS can do pretty much everything the PLS can do, but the PLS can only do it locally. So in my previous run, I actually used the PLS a lot because we were using them to kind of backtrack across the entire planet. But because we're only using inputs and outputs now, we want to make sure that the inputs can be gathered from anywhere in the universe, but the outputs can also be gathered from anywhere in the universe, because we only want to be building most of these builds once during the entire game. So that's why, in case you're wondering why I'm skipping the PLS. Of course, this is going to be building them, so you can easily get some out. You do have a little room over here that I'm not going to be using, so if you want, you can get in a snug little thingy like this, and then hook that up and siphon a few of these off if you want. That's completely up to you. I don't recommend doing so, but you could if you would want to. Now, processors. Processors need two things. They need components and they need circuit boards, as you can see. They actually don't need that many circuit boards, because circuit boards, well, they need a lot of circuit boards, but circuit boards are being produced at a pretty high speed. So it's 2 per second, assuming this has all the materials it needs. So what we can actually do is have just one over here, and that is enough to supply all of these things that all the circuit boards will ever need. So that is very nice. And as you can see, we're slowly starting to go down the tech tree in order to make all the higher level items. And yes, it's higher tier level items. Thank you, commenters. And yeah, I actually don't suck at pronouncing that word anymore. And now I just hope I remember how to pronounce it. Anyway, particle containers. Let's see. We will need 5 of those as well. And not processors, of course, we will need particle containers. Now, particle containers are one of the more annoying items to build in this game, I think, because the items they need are all over the place. So we need turbines, we need copper, just basic copper, and then we need graphene, which is a chemical facility item. So that is a little bit of a pain if you ask me, but we'll have to deal with it because that's what it takes. So if we have those, we should be good, but we will also need to make some, actually, let's put this one over. We will need to make some graphene, and we're going to be doing that all the way up there. There we go. So this is going to be our graphene belt. There. Now, as you know, we already had a belt with acid over there. So if we just put in some of these, and I should have enough of those actually. If you're building things with chemical plants, I recommend that you space them out a little more than you actually need to. That will help with any blueprints you make yourself. Of course, I'm doing it because I am making the blueprints for you. So if you're wondering why these are not spaced close together, that's why, because chemical plants are really the one building that probably makes the biggest mess out of blueprints in the entire game. So that's why they're spaced out. Just make sure you can plant them anywhere you want on the planet. So graphene on this belt over here. Thank you, autosave, for that stutter. Okay, there we go. Now, graphene needs sulfuric acid, which we will be getting on this belt over here, but we also need some graphite. And in order to build those, we only need some smelters. What we can actually do, because if you look at the ratio, we need basically 1 per second. We have to make this produce optimally. It's 3 per 3 seconds, so that's 1 per second effectively. And in order to make 1 per second, we're going to need 2 smelters making graphite, because it's producing at 1 per 2 seconds. So 2 of them is exactly 1 per second. Now, if we do that, we can actually not place it over there, but if we do place it nice and tight over there, then you can actually match it up directly into the chemical facility. And I like these batches of like 3 buildings closely working together. You don't actually need to put a belt for this, because we can straight plug in these 2 buildings into the mothership, so to speak. Maybe move that up 1. Oh, that's not what I meant to do. And this is why you don't want me making all these sorters 1 by 1. Something like that. And of course we do need to put it out on the belt, and we will need to draw in some some acid from this belt over here. So that's the basic idea of the sorters on a construction like this. Now, That fixes the graphene, so we have the acid and we have the graphite. And of course we do need a belt with coal coming in that we can probably get from that side, I think. But then we need the acid itself. And like I said, that might be a pain. And again, we will need quite a few items, quite a few buildings of this actually. So we need 6 in totals. And again, spacing them out. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. And let's set this to asset production. There we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually not close enough to reach. There we go. All right, so that's that. Let's see, what else do we need? Do we actually need? Yeah, we do need. Yeah, okay, never mind. Let's see. So what else do we need? We need some steel, and we have steel coming in over there. And let's just say we want steel to be producing over here, I think. Now, steel is actually an interesting item as well, because steel is produced from iron, straight up iron, and it needs 3 iron, but it needs 3 iron per 3 seconds. So if you actually just put one little smelter next to it that produces the iron, that produces the 1 per second, so every 3 seconds this is going to produce 3 iron, and that makes 1 steel. So if you have little groups of 2 of these buildings, like I have it over here, then that should be enough to actually completely fill up on the steel. Now, actually, I think we can probably move these 2 buildings over 1 slot. So let's do that, like so. And we are going to need a couple of these buildings. So I'm actually going to need 2 groups, or at least, sorry, 7 groups of 2. And this is, of course, 8 groups. And that's because we also need a tiny little bit of iron, extra iron, actually 2 per second. And that will be feeding into this circuit board building over here. And we are going to have to be a little bit tricky on how we supply it, but I'll show you in a moment. So this is going to be drawing in some iron, and then we are going to have these cute little couples over here. There we go. And then of course we want to have this producing steel. And again, these are 2 items, 2 buildings that you can plug straight into each other if you want. I assume this works. No, that doesn't work because it's too close. That's a shame actually. So then I will have to figure out on how to adjust for that. That's a shame. I wanted to plug those straight into each other. What am I going to do about that? I will figure that out in a moment, actually. We'll probably just have to space those out, but we will do that in a second. Now, what we could do is, I like this shape of this supply. In what I mean with that is have a belt of supply in the middle, and then have 2 rows of smelters on the outside, or assemblers in some cases, and then transport that straight into these buildings. And yeah, it kind of hooks up really nice, and it avoids very long rows of smelters, or at least even longer rows than we already have. And it kind of fits nicely into the compact building system that we're trying to make. All right, so this is going to be steel. And this is also going to be steel over here. And that of course means that we also need to be aware that we are going to need some titanium incoming over here. And then the last little belt is going to come out over here and go over here. And that is going to be transporting our iron into our circuit board production over here. Now, as you can see, this is one of the things that gave me a lot of issues initially, because we had to get iron from somewhere. It's not used in a lot of things in the vicinity. and it's only for this building, but we had to get it in there and we don't want any spaghetti. So I think this is a good way to avoid just that. All right, now let's see, what else do we need? We have the processors over here, and processors need circuit boards. We have that covered, but they also need components. And the interesting thing is circuit boards and components don't really work in a 1-to-1 ratio either, so that is a shame. But what we could actually do is make a belt over here, and I am going to put it here, and you'll see why in a moment. We are actually going to need 5 of these, producing the components. And although the ratio of processors and components isn't really 1-to-1, it does really nicely match up if you combine it with the circuit boards. So still some nice ratios over there. Now, we also need some particle containers, and for that we need turbines. And the interesting thing about these is that these do very nicely line up. So if we space them out exactly like the particle containers like that, we can plug those straight in, and like so. So it's 5 of these and 5 of those. Now, if you remember from one of the previous builds, we will also need the engines, and the engines are again in a 1-to-1 ratio. This is not actually going to work if I build it from this direction, so let's do it like that. And doing it like this will make sure that we have the exact ratio up and running, and this will be very similar to one of the previous builds that we did, where we also had some engines, because the engines are quite annoying because they need several things. They need the magnetic coils, which are also required by the turbines, but they also need the iron and they need the cogs. So in order to build those, we will have those feeding in from the middle over here, similar to what I did in the previous build. And then we have another row of these engines out there. Now, we also need the magnetic coils. So if we build those over here, we will also need 5 of those. We actually need quite a lot of these, but they produce at 2 per second, so that is nice. The ratios turn out quite evenly in this build, so that is really nice. And then if we make those and we simply transport those like this all the way around and then back in here, we can supply these engines from over here, we can supply these engines from over there, and we can also supply the turbines from over there. So this is all going to be magnetic coils. Now, that just leaves one thing, and that's the cogs, and those are coming from over here, and we also need 5 of those. Don't you just love these ratios? It's so nice and clean. And yeah, so we will have the cogs on this belt. We will have the iron on this belt actually. And remember that cogs are being made from iron as well. So we will need to find a source of iron on our right over there. We can't really take it from the left because we have our belt going up over there. But we're not quite done yet, because what else do we need? We need some copper. And we actually need a lot of copper in this build, which is not a good thing considering how little copper we have in our system. But once again, it's what we have, so we'll need to deal with that. I do need to move this one belt down, because we will have 12 smelters over here. And we will also need to get some magnets for the magnetic coils over there. So in order to get the magnets in, we will need to leave some space for that. So remember, we are looking to find some iron over here, and we're looking to find some magnets over here, and we are going to be producing copper in these smelters, and there's going to be 12 of those. Now that copper is going to be used in quite a lot of places. So what we're going to do is we are going to wrap that up there. Now I am hoping that I remember to leave some space. Yes, I did. Good. And then we're going to wrap it all the way up here. All the way up here. And then all the way down there. Because the copper is needed in the particle containers over here. It's also going to be used in the circuit boards over here. And it's also going to be used in the processors over here. And by doing it like that, we have all those areas covered very nicely. Okay. Let's make sure I don't run out of energy while I'm talking. Here we go. Okay. What else? We are going to need magnets, like I said. And we are going to need quite a lot of magnets. We are going to need 15 of these. And like I said before, if you need 15 of a building, just drag it out. Or at least 15 smelters, and that will give you exactly the max range. You can never build more than 15 at a time, so if you put it like that, you are always certain you're going to get exactly 15. You don't even have to count, and counting to 15 is something I'd like to avoid doing several times over in a game if I can help it. So that means we are going to need some iron over here, and we are going to get the magnets out over there. Now, of course, we do also need to supply the copper over here. So we'll have an external belt with the copper production over there. Now, as you can see, the build is already nicely shaping up. We have most of our base materials covered almost, and we actually have a few left that we need to deal with. One of them is actually going to be iron, even more iron than we are already requesting in here for the steel over there, for the magnets over here. As always, all these builds tend to be really iron hungry. So what we need is actually 12 more iron smelters. Now, I like to keep things symmetric if I can. So symmetric, sorry, and there we go. And once again, I'm going to use this little build where we get 3 on each, or 6 on each side. Not 6, 9 on each side. See, this is why you shouldn't have me count. I can't count. An actuary that can't count. That seems like a bad thing. Anyway, there we go. That should be iron, and then we have iron over here as well. There we go. And this is, of course, going to be iron production, like we said. Let's do it like that. Why is it not working? There you go. There you go. Iron, iron, iron. Lots of iron. Okay, so that's the iron. The iron will feed into here. The cogs will draw it from over there. The not these will actually draw in the rest of the iron, and this is taking 5 per second, and this is taking the rest per second basically. And that should take care of all of that. Now, that leaves silicon, and we will need some silicon because we want to feed this facility over here. The components are going to need some of the silicon. It's actually going to need a fair amount of silicon as well, but if we keep doing the same thing with the nice side by side around the input, then if we do it like that, this is going to give us a nice belt of silicon over here. And of course, if we set the recipe over here, we won't forget that this is actually building silicon. And then we're almost done. Now, we will need, like I said, we're going to need a lot of materials coming in. And if I finish marking this up, you will see why. Remember, this was the titanium incoming as well. This is the outgoing belt of acid. This is the acid production over here. And then we will have to get in a few more items because, as we know, acid requires 3 items in quite large quantities. And we will need to get those out of there from somewhere else. Now, this is going to be stone, this is going to be oil, and this is going to be water. And I always recommend doing it in that order, like I explained in the previous video, because as you can see, you will need the most stone, so keep that closest. You need the most oil after that, and you need the item you need the least is going to be on the outer belt, which in this case is water. Doesn't really matter if you have the Mark III sorters, as we do now, but you might as well just keep it in mind. It's a good practice to kind of have that in your system, especially if you're doing earlier game builds, because there it does really matter. It can cripple the speed of your facilities if you set the wrong belts on the wrong sorters, etc. Okay, so let's charge up a little bit while we talk through the last little bit of this build. As you can see, we have everything sorted now. We do still need to sort out the issue with these smelters not being able to connect when they're side by side, so that's a shame. I'll just space them a little bit out. But other than that, that should take care of that. We should have enough room in this build to do that. And if I turn off the grid there for a moment, because it's getting a little bit in the way, like you can see, we need 1, 2, 3 resources over here. We need 1, 2, 3, 4 resources over here as well. And that is not even, so that's 7 already, and that is not counting the coal just yet that I actually forgot, because what we also need is coal over here, and because that will turn into the graphite. So as you can see, we actually need to request several items up here. Honestly, what you could do, and this is just a little bit of personal preference, but we have this empty room here in the middle. So what we could actually do is remove one of these belts and bring that down over here. It's completely up to you if that's also something you want to do. But I like to kind of not have these highways of belts if I can avoid it. Not really for any specific reason, I just don't like the look of it. And as I said, in terms of the sorters, it's more efficient to keep everything on one side. So this will mean that we get in the stone from... no, actually, let's make this the oil. Doesn't really matter, honestly. And then this can be the water. And remember, this was the coal. So 1, 2, 3, 4 over here, and then we have the iron, titanium, silicon, and copper over here. So that's another 4. The nice thing about having 8 different inputs is that if we put 2 Interstellar Logistics Stations over here, they can each request 5 different items, but we can set them to request 4 each, and then have the 5th slot reserved for warpers later in the game. Alternatively, you can have one of those ILSs request the item you need the most, which in this case is iron. So you have an additional amount of iron coming in. It won't really be needed for this build, but I'm just pointing it out, that's something you could do. And then have the ILS requesting warpers simply supply it directly into the other one, because you don't actually need to request it in the warper itself in order to benefit from warpers, as long as they're coming in from somewhere. Other than that, I think this build looks pretty nice. It's pretty nice and sleek. We will need some power, of course, in this build, and we're going to have to supply it with, again, 8 different resources, so that will take me some time. So I will do that, and we'll be meeting right back here. Alrighty, and there we are. I completed all the sorters, all the belts, all the materials. I flew back to the second planet to get some more silicon and titanium, and I got back here and wrapped everything up. So, but before I show you the end build, there was again a small mistake I made with the belts, and if that's your thing, you can go back right now, check what my mistake was, and mark it down for yourself, and then see if you were right. So, last chance to do that, and I'll show you what I did wrong, and of course I did correct that right away. I forgot one belt here with the engines, so there was actually no belt with engines going out, and nothing wrapping up all the way in the back here, so it could go into the turbines. And if you notice, these belts actually go around, so you might be wondering, hey, but TDA, where are these engines going? They are going straight into the turbines. So it's a kind of a hybrid system where I put half of the engines on a belt and transport them all the way around. That's why I left that room over here, by the way. And the other engines are going straight into the turbine. So as always, they have a 2-to-1 ratio, and this is kind of just the hybrid system where you transport some of them straight in and the other half is coming from the other direction all around with the belt. That does mean that they also needed to kind of rearrange the whole situation here with the copper. And because of the placement of the copper, and the copper also need to go into the magnetic coils, I wrapped them around this way, the same way I did initially, but they started over here and then used the splitter to feed them back to the right as well. So this belt will quickly saturate, so then the remaining copper goes around. As you can see now, it's kind of ground to a standstill because I ran out of silicon, but you get the point, I think. Yeah, everything else is just hooked up over here. We have quite a lot of iron coming in. We actually have more than a full belt of iron being requested, but because this won't be functioning non-stop anyway, that's not a big deal. I see that for some reason some of the titanium silicon got over on this belt, so let's get that off. Not sure why that happened. I might have misplaced everything in the same box initially over here, so that explains that. The good news is that means we can make maybe one more. And of course I have these boxes supplied in the blueprint as well, but you want to be replacing them with a ILS pretty quickly after you build this build. As we mentioned, I rearranged the steel facilities over here a little bit so they can actually be directly connected to each other. It doesn't really make sense to put a belt. You can if you want. I like this specific build. But other than that, nothing changed over here. And of course, last but not least, we did get our ILS up and running. So we have 4 of them now. And I intentionally left a little bit of space in the build over here. So you can actually remove this box when you're done with it. And then place an ILS over here to kind of celebrate your victory. And of course we don't actually have the vessels or drones just yet. But this will be very nicely supplying the rest of our universe with Interstellar Logistics Stations. Now remember, and if you haven't watched my tutorial on ILSs, I do recommend that you watch it. How you set these things does matter quite a lot. For example, we don't necessarily want this to produce more than 100 at a time, maybe 200. Just to have a little bit of a buffer, but 200 ILSs is already a bunch load of materials. You definitely don't want 10,000 of these, let's put it like that. You also do want to set this at local demand supply, and in the case of an outgoing ILS, of course, you do want to put this at a minimum load of 1% if you're transporting buildings or any other low quantity materials. If this was a resource building, you would be setting this at the maximum load probably. The drones in this case doesn't matter because this is only going to be transporting around the world, but just for the sake of it, you can set it at 1% as well. The warp settings is mostly a preference thing. I generally just leave it at 12 AU. It's a power thing. Once you have warp, it does consume a lot of power. This is fine for me. It doesn't really matter that much. Charging power neither, but you do want to make sure you have vessels in here when you build them, so don't forget to do that. Another thing you might want to do, I can't do it right now because I haven't unlocked the research yet, but you do want to make sure this is actually being supplied with warpers. So for the moment, I'm just going to leave this as is, but don't forget, once you start placing these down, you will want to be supplying everything with warpers and things like that. Similarly, you can of course put a few ILSs, for example, over here, where these boxes are now. You probably want to replace these and make sure you just plop down one of these. Maybe put it down a little bit more to the bottom because you do want to have about 2 of these in. So you could, in theory, get one over here and then one down there. I'm Am I going to do that? Yeah, why not? Let's see. So, just take those out. And take those out. And then I think you should have enough room for one over here. There you go. It's just too close. Oh, that's a shame. You do get a nice little error or warning just before you delete one of those. That's quite useful because they tend to be stuck full of materials. Oh, that's a shame. We can't fit it in. Well, if we can't fit it in like I want them to, you might as well make it look pretty. So let's just put it in the middle over there then. Initially, you don't want to be worrying too much about the iron anyway. But of course, you do need to make sure you keep the iron coming here. But it's the main purpose of the ILS initially is titanium and silicon. So make sure you're requesting this. And again, this is personal preference, but what I tend to do is actually have this just demand everything. And maybe not set it to a huge amount, because again, this is not going to be a fast producing building anyway. We don't have vessels or drones just yet. Charging power, again, doesn't matter. I do set this to the maximum amount. If you're going to use a drone and vessel in this system, in this building, you might as well make it work to the full extent. But first of all, don't forget to actually have the outgoing belts selected, because otherwise everything will get stuck in the building itself. Second of all, what I'm going to do is I'm actually not going to put vessels in these buildings, and I'm just going to have these in the supplying buildings. Why? Because, to be honest, this planet is going to be drained on a lot of power already because of all the production facilities. I don't necessarily need a whole bunch of vessels also to be draining the power from this system. But what you could do is just put in one or two. Again, this doesn't need a whole lot of supplies. And if you just put in one or two, and you put this a little bit lower than max, and you put all the supplying ones at the maximum load, you will always make sure that there is at least some materials going into this build. Again, you want to have everything supplied with resources anyway, but if you do that, at least you will make sure this is always working. Again, what I'm going to do is actually only have the supplying side have vessels included, but it's completely up to you whether or not you follow that or you put some vessels in here as well. Actually, there is two more things I need to mention. So first of all, if you're building along with me, I don't think I properly showed the location just yet. So we're actually a little bit east of where we have the foundations, and there is a coal veins over there as well as two iron patches, so it's pretty easy to locate that. We kind of snug in the blueprint or building facility here in between the coal vein and the iron veins. So if you want to build along, this is where it is. I'm getting some oil from up here. Now that's the second thing I wanted to mention. As you will recognize, this is just one of those simple oil facilities I've already been showing you, but I did upgrade the blueprint now to only use Mark III belts and Mark III sorters. Is that something you need to follow? I recommend that you do so, because otherwise you will need to carry around those Mark I belts and Mark I sorters all the time, or every time you build one of these upgraded. So it's just convenient to have the Mark III one. In case you want to build more oil facilities, and you probably want to be building quite a few more of those. Alright, so as I said, this was a bit of a longer episode, quite a complex build, a lot of things to explain, a lot of things to do. I think the next few builds might be a little bit simpler, but I hope you enjoyed this longer one as well. And as always, if you're here, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Subscribe, make sure that you get access to everything else as well. And just let me know in general that you like this series. It's always good to have feedback. I will triple check the blueprints this time to make sure everything is in that. So hopefully no one is able to find a single belt missing, sorter missing, or anything like that. But if you do find it, please let me know. and I'll correct the blueprint as soon as I see it, so that everyone else after you will make sure that they don't run into the same issue either. All right, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I will catch you in the next one.